Welcome to another edition of The Oath and the Office featuring Professor Corey Brettschneider. I am not Professor Corey Brettschneider. I am John Fugelsang, and I'm like Ringo. I'm just glad to be here. But let me introduce the man of the hour, please. The professor of political science who enriches the lives of students at Brown University, the man you have read in Politico, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, the man who is the author of the book The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents, and the man who is the author of The Presidents and the People, Five Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, the man who was thrown out of Wu-Tang Clan for being too damn hardcore. People, I give you Professor Corey Brettschneider. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks so much, John. And I've got to push back. There's no way that you're the Ringo of this group. For one thing, we've only got two people, and so that's got to be John and Paul. I'm not sure who's with, but certainly if you're Paul, that's an equal.
All right, if there's two people in the group, I'm the Meg White of this group, and I'll be impressed if you get that reference. But Corey, there's so much we have to get to, and I'm really glad we're doing a show right now. We talked about some of this week on my Sirius XM show, but a lot of things are starting to crumble and seem kind of weird, and I've got a lot of dumb questions that I need a constitutional scholar to help me with. We've talked a lot over the past few months about Kilmar Abrego Garcia and how he was kidnapped by the government, even though a previous judge had ordered him to be kept in the U.S. He was making his meetings with the immigration folks, seemingly staying out of trouble. They kidnapped him. They renditioned him to this torture prison. I won't call it deportation because those are legal. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the White House. They still, after being ruled against, the White House delayed compliance for weeks. We've talked about, is this a constitutional crisis or just a constitutional challenge? Now he's finally been brought back, and he's talking about the amount of torture that this government is sending civilians to. And yet the White House is trying to shut him up. So he's still suing the government for what they did. And I think, Corey, the White House's whole defense is, dude, you're home now. What's the problem? So you were sent away for a few months to a torture gulag, but here you are. Why are you complaining? Am I getting the gist of the government's argument here?
I think they wish this would go away because they've been caught trying to destroy due process. And, that's a kind of abstract seeming idea, due process. It sounds legalistic or it sounds technical. And what you see in this case of Mr. Abrego Garcia is that this isn't abstract. If you don't have a right to appear in court, which is really at minimum what we're talking about when we're talking about due process, what's that going to lead to? It might lead to people who are supposedly non-citizens being deported and are actually citizens, and you heard that argument from Mike Zamor of the ACLU, or, and this might have sounded like hyperbole, it might lead to actual torture of individuals who
Yes.
are assured basic human rights under our Constitution and under global documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, a document that's supposed to be inspired by our own Constitution. And yet what you see here is if you don't have the right to appear in court, you don't have these basic procedural rights of the rule of law, it did result in torture, not that it might. And the graphic detail of what happened to this individual, the way that in being sent to a literal gulag, he lost all humanity, had his dignity degraded in the worst way. That's really what this is about. So
Yeah.
this episode is, going to be an examination in part of the ongoing coup by this administration, partly a coup against basic constitutional rights like due process and free speech. We'll talk about that in the beginning. But it's also an assault on Congress, and we're going to talk about the ways in which congressional power has been eviscerated with these firings. All of this, we have to connect the dots, is really a threat not just to individual rights, but to all rights and to our system of democracy.
And I also want to promise our listeners we will get to Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, we'll talk more about Jeffrey Epstein than the president and the attorney general are talking about Jeffrey Epstein. But that's later in the show. Right now, this guy, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, still in a cage. He's facing these criminal charges that appear, Corey, to have been assembled in a panic by the DOJ, completely based on hearsay from, let's call them incentivized informants. This is the weaponization of the criminal justice system as a way for a government to save face rather than serve justice. And Judge Paula Zinis compared the government's behavior to nailing Jell-O to a wall. That doesn't sound good, Corey. Let's not forget the one DOJ lawyer who admitted in court we erroneously deported this man was fired. So what recourse, if any, does a federal judge have when the executive branch simply refuses to comply with the law? It took 2 months for Pam Bondi to obey the law.
Well, there is still the ongoing question of whether or not there'll be contempt charges, and there might not be in the immediate future, but there might be at some point for the disobeying Judge Boasberg's order and the deportations of Venezuelans to El Salvador. That's one kind of recourse. But the other kind of recourse you're seeing in real time, which is now that he's back in the country, he does have rights to due process. He is appearing before judges. And there's a question of whether or not he'll successfully sue for this deportation. And is also a way of putting on trial in real time the administration's claim that, after all, this was a criminal. That's all that we've heard from them from the beginning.
That's
What do
right.
you care about due process? This is a criminal. So
Yeah.
what if we send him to this horrible prison in El Salvador that's known for human rights violations, and now we know even torture? It's a criminal. And now we're asking the question, well, what crime did he commit? Show it in court. That's what due
Yeah.
process is all about. And they're not going to be able to show it, I don't think. That's what it's looking like, despite all their rhetoric. I thought in the beginning, okay, maybe they have this amazing case, but it looks like they don't. And that's what due process is all about. They've been bluffing and bluffing and bluffing, and now it's time to show your cards. What do you have against him? They're claiming that he was involved in trafficking, for instance. Well, okay, let's see this evidence. And
Yeah.
it's not a lot.
Yeah, you know why? Because he was an Uber driver. They're literally trying to use his roots he did as an Uber driver to say that I mean, this is desperate. And we saw DOJ officials resign rather than put their names on this indictment. I mean, I don't think the criminal charges against this guy pass constitutional muster myself. It seems like a smokescreen that's meant to just prolong his detention and somehow justify his mistreatment. They are looking for a good reason to justify what they already did to this person.
Well, it's no problem if you're denying due process and just engaged in administration. Well, we've been calling it kidnapping because it's not deportation, which suggests a legal process. Nobody can see that. There's no transparency. Now, when you have to show up in court and actually present the evidence for this repeated claim by the administration that this is a criminal, okay, what is the crime? What's the evidence of the crime? That's how the system of due process works. And you see why this isn't just some abstract idea written into our Fifth and 14th Amendments. It's really the way of holding a president and an administration to account that wants to label people they don't like or on a whim to use them for political gain criminals. And now actually crime is a real category in the law. You've got to show, by the way, beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases that a crime has been committed. Put the evidence on the table, and it just doesn't look like it's here. And that what's being
Yeah.
revealed is that this is a propaganda BS story that they're using, exactly as you say, to cover themselves.
Okay, can I drag you and our listeners even deeper into the swamp on this one, Corey? Because let's go back through the mists of time to a distant land we call May of this year, 2 months ago, when we heard nonstop from the White House and the Justice Department, he's never coming back. We have no power to bring this man back. He's sorry. We're just the United States. That's El Salvador. He's in a prison. There, we just don't have. We saw senators going to visit him. Oh, we don't have the power to bring him back. Now, a top State Department official under Marco Rubio, named Michael Kozak, appears to have submitted sworn testimony about how the U.S. has no power over his detention in El Salvador. This now directly contradicts statements made by El Salvador to the UN, and hey, the guy's back. So, how serious is it, Professor, legally speaking, when US officials mislead or lie under oath to federal judges, like in this clear case? What are the consequences? Who enforces them when it's the executive branch doing the lying? I mean, could this open up officials like Mr. Kozak to perjury charges? Or would we need a
Yes.
DOJ, or would we need a DOJ who cares? Because who's going to prosecute him for it?
One theme that we'll talk about throughout the episode is it's difficult, frankly, to hold the federal government to account. There are all sorts of immunities and protections. There are ways to sue, and we'll talk about them too towards the end of the episode. But one thing you can definitely do if an individual member of the administration has committed a crime is bring criminal charges. So I mentioned the contempt charges that stem from the refusal to obey a court order in the original case of the deportations when those planes were told to go back. And if you commit perjury, it doesn't matter if you work for the government, you're not insulated.
Yeah.
So I think what's happening with this case, and I want to say something too about why this case is so historically important, is that we're starting to see the cover up. We're starting to see the shame and the criminal actions that happen in the cover up are susceptible to prosecution. In the Nixon case, so much of the crime happened in the cover-up of Watergate in particular, not just in the original crimes of Watergate and the attack on Ellsberg and others. So that's part of what we're seeing. Let me say something about this case, because we've been talking about it not just today at length, but in past episodes and with guests, and we'll continue to talk about it. The reason it's so important is because there are certain cases in American history that really stand for the question of whether or not we're going to defend basic rights under the Constitution or whether or not we're going to jettison them. Think of Brown versus Board of Education. We not only talked about that a lot as it was pending, but throughout American history, we talk about it every year at length. This case is about nothing less than the question of whether or not due process, the right to appear before a judge, the ability to be governed by law rather than the whims of one man, Donald Trump, whether that's a real thing or not. And that's the question here. And I'm hoping that we prevail, the rule of law, but the fact that it's so unclear makes this case historic, regardless of what happens in the end to this really put upon, abused individual, Mr. Abrego Garcia.
Judge Holmes, who granted Abrego Garcia bail, said the government's evidence was so flawed, it was patently unreliable. I mean, magistrate judges are often former prosecutors, right? Like openly skeptical of the government's entire case and giving voice to that. Like the judges aren't buying this. It seems like we're all dancing around the fact that these people are just craven, crummy liars. But do you see parallels here, Corey, to the Bush era use of enemy combatant status? Or even the Obama era drone strike memos, which really abused the word imminent to kill lots of people. I mean, how does this differ or even escalate beyond past executive abuses?
Well, I think there is a historical parallel, and there's some. There was an argument called a case called Boumediene, in which the Bush administration argued that Guantanamo Bay was a law-free zone, meaning it wasn't under the jurisdiction of the United States. And the court rejected that, the Supreme Court, thankfully, saying there's no such thing as a law-free zone. If the United States is in control, then you have basic rights of due process and habeas corpus. So that's obviously that ruling, the Boumediene ruling, might be relevant to the question of what happened to Mr. Abrego Garcia in El Salvador, because it looks like it's more analogous to Guantanamo and that there was
You're
control
right.
of the United States rather than somehow it being just outside the country. And certainly they were involved with that country, the administration, in coordinating. So he didn't lose his constitutional rights. But to answer your question, John, it really goes way beyond anything that happened in the Bush administration. As horrible as the abuses of Abu Ghraib were, and the attempt to argue that there were individuals in Guantanamo who were beyond the law, I'm not a fan of that. It was a horrible moment. But what this is really an attempt to do is to go back not to the Bush administration, but to 1798, to the John
Yeah.
Adams administration, and the use of the Enemy Aliens Act in 1798 to try to obliterate all rights of perceived political enemies. That was the idea. Now, that was part of a larger assault on democracy, including the Sedition Act, which I've talked to you often about, an attack on citizens, the Alien Friends Act, which did a lot to take away the rights of non-citizens who are even citizens of friendly nations. But the one law that remains on the books from that horrible period certainly should have been abolished, should have been revoked, is the Alien Enemies Act. And so
Yeah.
we have this remnant and what Adams did, in my opinion, goes way beyond what Bush did. It was really an attempt to eliminate the opposition party, to destroy all rights of non-citizens. And you're seeing that revived again. We're back to this original question that we saw during the Adams administration, which is, are we going to have an authoritarian constitution, as John Adams claimed, that was based on an idea of monarchy, or are we going to have a democratic constitution? And the jury's still out, unfortunately.
Well, you know what? We've talked a lot about the lack of heroes in this time and how we're so disappointed in all the capitulation and all the groveling weasel trains all the way to Mar-a-Lago of law firms and university officials and media figures. It's nice to celebrate citizens who are actually not waiting for someone to come and handle this. And let's talk about the American Association of University Professors. Not the American Association of groveling college presidents, mind you, but university professors who are suing deeply morally compromised Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And let's be honest, Corey, That bitch knows better. That bitch knows better. But they're arguing that these students have First Amendment rights that are being violated, even though they're here on a student visa. The AAUP versus Rubio case. They're arguing that kidnapping and renditioning pro-Palestinian rights students, not anti-Israel. None of these people have said anything anti-Semitic, but deporting pro-Palestinian students and faculty violates the First Amendment. We've talked about this before, but let's hit it again. Non-citizens can assert First Amendment rights in this context. Can they not, Professor? The First Amendment is there to put limitations on the government, not humans who are speaking.
As you know, listeners are always asking us, where's the hope? Where's the hope? And if you look at the 290 plus reviews that we've already got on Amazon, so many of them talk about the hope that we're able to bring, even in the midst of this dire moment. And this case is definitely one of those moments, because as much as the administration is assaulting due process, they are openly saying that non-citizens have no right to free speech. Part of that has manifested itself in them looking at visitors to the United States and their social media for criticism of Donald Trump and turning them away if they have criticized the president. And I heard, as you know, scholars in Finland of the United States saying they don't want to come to the United States because they're sick of this. Of course, they're writing on social media about the attack on this democracy by this president, Donald Trump. And so, who's going to fight back? We saw the case of Mr. Khalil, who was seized for, again, not anti-Semitic statements, but statements, right, defending Palestinians. And regardless of where you are on this issue, just think about it. He took a stand on one of the most controversial issues of the day and was arrested for it and held in a detention center in Louisiana. We heard from Mike Zamore about how the ACLU had to drive 2 hours to get to him from any airport. That was intentional to try to deprive him of counsel.
That's right.
And they're not claiming he committed a crime. They're just looking at the fact that he, engaged in speech that they don't like. And the administration also, just to put a pin on that part of it before we get to the AAUP, has been rebuked. When a judge looked at this, it took him a while, but he did the right thing in the end. He gave up on this silly argument that he had made a mistake on his application for a green card and instead said, this is really about the First Amendment. Anyway, he's out now, and he is back to using his free speech. But more importantly, this isn't about any one individual. It's about the right of our universities to even engage in free speech. And our universities, of course, are filled with people who are not citizens. We want them here because we're engaged in a worldwide dialogue about questions of science, questions of history, questions of politics. And so fighting back, finally, the AAUP is taking a stand on this specific issue, calling out the administration for shutting down the free speech rights of non-citizens. And just to really emphasize it, I want to just say what the First Amendment says. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It doesn't say anything about citizenship. And that revocation, that rebuke to John Adams, that was the vindication of the idea of free speech. And yet again, here we are fighting for it again.
We got to hit a break, but I mean, it's really an amazing case, and hats off to the AAUP for doing this. Let's see more people follow suit. Corey, we have a lot more to cover. I got to talk to you about the mass firings at federal agencies that the Supreme Court greenlit, and again, Jeffrey Epstein. We'll get to that too. This is The Oath in the Office. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office with Professor Corey Brettschneider. I am John Fugelsang. Corey, the Supreme Court just greenlit Donald Trump's mass federal layoffs, lifting the order that had blocked him. This case was really a test of the extent of the White House's power to rapidly decimate the government and reorganize everything without any input from Congress. So tens of thousands of public servants who have done nothing wrong, from climate scientists to DOJ staffers, will be fired so Donald Trump can replace them with blindly obedient bootlickers. Let me ask about this decision. What was the legal reasoning behind the court's decision? And what precedent, if any, does this reverse or reinterpret?
Well, the question in our last discussion was about whether or not the administration's attack on due process and free speech is going to succeed. And in this section of our conversation, starting with this important case, what we're going to talk about is the question of whether or not the assault on Congress is going to succeed. Now, the way the administration's framing it is, these are my employees. The civil servants of the federal government work for me. And so when Elon Musk and Doge recommended the firing, of course I can do it. That's the theory of the unitary executive, that the executive branch has total control over the civil service. But that's not the tradition of democracy. And so the pushback against it is No, there are laws passed by Congress, there's money allocated, and the civil servants are charged with executing the law. That's actually what Article 2 talks about. The president is supposed to faithfully execute the office and faithfully execute the law, Article 2, that creates the presidency and defines its role and limits it. And so the firings, these cases argue, are a destruction of the ability of Congress to engage in basic lawmaking. They're passing laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and then there are civil servants charged with carrying them out. In education, a series of education acts dating back to some of the most important in the 60s. The Department of Education is supposed to carry them out, yet the administration
Yeah.
in firing all of these people is doing nothing less than usurping the power of Congress to pass laws. Now, what's the court said? It hasn't opined for sure. There's still some chance that the power of Congress might prevail. But for now, they've said we're going to allow these firings to proceed as this case continues. And they've used a phrase about the likelihood of success that they use in cases that are ongoing. And they've said there's not enough of a likelihood of success of the challenge to the administration's firing that we're going to stop it for now. So it's not a good moment when it comes to the power of Congress. I'll go back to that idea of the self-coup. What a self-coup does is destroy the judiciary and rights like free speech and due process. And the other thing that a self-coup does is destroy Congress. And that's what this case is
Yeah.
really about.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Justice Jackson's dissent, and she was the only one. This was a 8-1, but she said this ruling effectively lets the president discard the democratic system that created these laws. Do you agree? Are we watching the erosion of separation of powers just so he can have a bunch of obedient yes men fill our government?
Wow. What I said in a lot of words, Justice Jackson says in such a pithy, clean way. That yes, this case isn't about firing and control of the president over his employees. It's about the power of Congress to create laws and to have an executive branch that carries them out. If the system doesn't work that way, the way that we all learned about in seventh grade civics, hopefully that's what we learned, you don't have democracy. So what do you have instead? That looks like dictatorship to me, that the president gets to decide because he's the leader. That's
Right.
what Pam Bondi and Trump believed our system is. And they are really trying to replace our actual system of the rule of law and the role of Congress with this system. I have friends that I hear about, they don't want their names mentioned, but they're listening, I know, many of them in the civil service and the executive branch. They don't see their job as being loyal to the president. They're hanging in there because they are charged with congressional legislation passed by past Congresses, signed by presidents for
Mm-hmm.
decades, in some cases centuries, to carry out the law. And that's why they're hanging in there. And I wish them the best of luck as they go through this assault, not just on them and their professions, but on democracy itself.
With this ruling, though, let me ask you, as the official dumb guy of the show, could a future president just fire entire departments like the CDC or the EPA or I don't know, the Pentagon if they disagree politically? Are we exposed to full authoritarian restructuring at the whim of one person?
Look, I try not to engage in hyperbole, but when extreme words are called for, we've got to discuss it. And your question logically just entails pulling out the consequence of a decision that would uphold these firings, because so many of these firings are really the destruction of agencies. So the Department of Education, led by the former CEO of the World WWE, and formerly, I guess I watched it when it was WWF. This isn't somebody with a deep concern for the rule of law, and she's helping this president destroy not just her agency, the Department of Education, but the legislation that was passed that took a civil rights movement to enact a death of a president and really trying to eviscerate not just the department itself, but the carrying out of laws. Because my worry is, the Department of Education is actually created during the Carter administration, but it's the place where all of this legislation is carried out. And so without it, well, where is it going to happen? And I don't think that they're going to reformulate earlier ways of carrying these laws out. I think they're planning to just disregard them.
Yeah.
And so they are destroying the federal government for the most part, except in one area. And partly it's defense, but it's also Homeland Security and ICE and the buildup of this authoritarian state. So we talked about last week in particular was how frightening this bill was that just has now been passed by both chambers because of its buildup of a police state. But that money comes from somewhere. It partly comes from the deficit that will be increased, but it also comes from
Yes.
the destruction of these other agencies.
Yeah, I hope your kids are excited to pay for that, Corey, and their kids too. Let me go deeper into the weeds with you and just ask a couple questions about the tariffs case, which is going to be argued soon in the D.C. Circuit. Now, back in June, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit put a stay on this, blocking the implementation of the Court of International Trade ruling that struck down Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. This case was brought by small businesses and several U.S. states. Corey, what is their central legal argument against the government about the tariffs, and what laws or principles are they challenging?
Well, I should say I know the person who's brought this amazing case together, Ilya Somin. I think very highly of him. I've talked to him about this case. He would like to be a guest on this show, and I'm sure we will.
I'll decide that. I'll decide that, Corey. Go on. I'll be the
He
judge
warned
of
me that his comedy skills were he was going to work on them, and I assured him that's not his role.
that.
But this guy really is carrying out a heroic mission here because what he's doing is saying that these tariffs, although they are just implemented at the whim of the president, of course they're not going to work. That aside from that, there's a deeper concern. He's gotten a number of litigants that he's representing, and he's had an amazing victory already, and so he's trying to replicate it. And in a three-judge panel now, he's going to try to replicate it again with the full Washington, D.C. circuit, the court right below the Supreme Court. And what he's saying is, and I just think this is so important, is that there were a series of laws passed in the 1970s that are still on the books that define what an emergency is and what it isn't. And those laws
Mm.
include the Emergencies Act and a law that defines specifically the use of economic sanctions, including tariffs, passed subsequently the year after the Emergencies Act. And what these do is they define emergency in order to limit it. And the history here is so important. There was a belief that presidents, by many presidents before these laws, that the president had an inherent power to declare emergencies and do whatever he or she wanted. And these laws were meant to say, no, only really unusual circumstance, abnormal, not just the normal, you don't like the trade imbalance.
Right.
That was the purpose of this legislation. So he's saying there's a law in the books that governs an emergency, and this ain't it. And the courts so far have sided with him. So shout out to Ilya and his great team that he's brought on, including Neil Katyal and Michael McConnell. And I'm really hoping for the best. And at some point, as I've told them, I don't know if it'll be in this round, but I'm likely going to put together an amicus brief because I feel so strongly in reviving the ideas of these 1970s laws as constraints on the presidency. And if the courts let Trump get away with it, it's not just letting bad economic policy go through, it's destroying the thing that we did have after Nixon to try to constrain presidential power.
And by reviving the ideas of these 1970s laws, you mean reminding people we have laws? Is that what you mean? Reminding
Uh,
people that laws actually exist?
So,
Um,
John, there are many reasons I love doing this show, but when you say things like that, that is just, purely what this is about. It's about, do we have laws or not? Exactly.
well, what's interesting to me about this lawsuit, and I really hope it gets more heat, is that this is quite an alliance. The plaintiffs are private businesses and
Yep.
state governments together. I
Yep.
mean, conservative friends lean in on this, and a lot of folks, Corey, are saying that this is a case of taxation without representation. Would you agree with that framing?
Yeah, I think it's an evisceration not of just of those two particular laws that we talked about, the law limiting economic emergencies and the law limiting emergencies, period, pure legislation. But aside from that, it's about the structure of government. It's about the idea that we don't just have in Article 2, which creates the presidency. There's another thing that comes before it, Article 1, that creates the Congress, and that has taxation power. It has
Yeah.
the power to enact tariffs or not. And this isn't the way to do it, just to usurp the power of law, period, by declaring an emergency. And one of the things that is very interesting about this case is if you look at the individuals, this is getting into the weeds, but you have the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian organization, and you have many libertarians, but you also have Neil Katyal now joining that team. And Neil, of course, a former acting Solicitor General during the Obama administration. So it's a coalition of people, as we keep seeing happen. And this is part of the hope of people who have different political views, but who care about preserving the basics of our Constitution.
And this is where I have to remind everybody that every lower court that has ruled on this issue has said the tariffs weren't legal. So let me just close this one out, Corey, because we want to get to Epstein. What does winning mean in a case like this? Like, if the plaintiff succeeded and these tariffs were ruled unconstitutional, what happens next? I mean, would that roll back similar actions from the Trump era or even current policies?
Well, it puts pressure on Congress. You want tariffs, you have to own it. And it's not that tariffs are unconstitutional in themselves or anything like that, but it pushes back to the Congress its role in trying to say, okay, we should have a tax on China. We should have, and Americans are going to pay for it. We should have a tax on whatever country. They're talking about Vietnam at many different points, and not just handing over the power by fiat to the administration to destroy our economy with massive tariffs. By the way, even if tariffs do make sense in some cases, it doesn't make sense in the way they're using it, which are arbitrary. And the whole idea of the rule of law is to make us deliberate, make us debate about this issue. Fine, I want to listen to economists. I'd love to hear a debate in Congress. I'd love to see them own a tariff policy if that's what we're going to shift to, but not allowing a dictator to just simply on a whim, depending on how he's feeling that day, enact tariff or not. And by the way, how did they picking the rates? It looks at one point there was reporting that suggested it's so random. Maybe they were just using chatbot GPT or something.
Corey, at times like this, I just feel so much safer knowing that churches can openly endorse politicians now. It just makes me feel great. It's just ooh, thank you, IRS. All right, we got to hit a break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about Epstein. I also want to ask you, can we just sue ICE? Can people just sue him? Why are we hearing this conversation more? We'll be right back in just a moment with The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office with Professor Corey Brettschneider. I am John Fugelsang. And Corey, I know you are sharing the pain and sorrow with me that MAGA's Super Bowl has been canceled. The Epstein list, Corey. This was MAGA's final fantasy. The Epstein list would be their smoking gun, the great reveal. This was to be the karmic hammer that would finally expose all the liberals and elites and all the Hollywood lizard people in one beautiful PowerPoint of perversion. They thought this would be Hunter Biden's laptop, but with even more penis photos they could have on their computers and put all over social media. Corey, these MAGA folks were promised for years by the Dan Bonginos and Kash Patels. They were promised by the Donald Trumps and the Pam Bondis. They were promised Hollywood elites on this list and Democrat donors and Obama himself. And all they got was Prince Andrew again and a note that said, please stop calling. Corey, 5 months ago, Pam Bondi was on Fox News, because I don't miss it, saying the Epstein list, the Epstein client list is sitting on my desk right now to review. And this week, Pam Bondi has released a memo saying there was no list. He blackmailed no one. He died by suicide. It was the little black book that cried wolf. And MAGA's freaking out. They're all very upset. Nazis don't like to see Nazis protecting Nazis. Even Kevin Sorbo is confused. Hercules, the dumb years. He's like, is she lying or just incompetent? I mean, the Star of God's Not Dead 3, folks. And my whole point on this, Corey, is I try to tell my MAGA friends when they call SiriusXM every night, Trump was never going to expose Jeffrey Epstein. That would be like Colonel Sanders starting an animal rights hotline. And Trump's DOJ, which is full of sycophants, has zero incentive to ever dig deeper. This whole thing, I think the Epstein gate is more like the Theranos of scandals. It's all hype, all data, and a lot of grifters trying to sell you stock. But the whole thing just proves that MAGA's not mad because they were lied to, Professor. I think they're mad because they didn't get the lie they wanted.
John, I love that way of putting it, the emotion. So much of being a professor is on the one hand, on the other hand, this is not a situation like that. It is just a moment in which you're watching in real time. The administration here, as much as, some of these issues are, we have to go deep, we have to explain it. But I think what we're seeing here, and it's hard not to just watch it with a sense that maybe finally the myth of MAGA is going to be destroyed. It's all about this authoritarian president lying to people, telling
Yes.
them again and again that he is trying to destroy pedophiles, that he cares about the issues that they care about, like child sex trafficking. And when it comes to one of the worst pedophiles, sex traffickers, Jeffrey Epstein, it looks like, this was a friend of his. We have the video of the two of them together. And what you're seeing in real time in his refusal to release information about what actually was going on in that case, what you're seeing in real time is the lie being exposed. And some of MAGA at this moment, and this is a horrible case in many ways, but it's also a good thing in that we're watching that lie be exposed in real time. And some of them are going to think, okay, maybe the Epstein thing wasn't a big deal. They'll go along with the authoritarianism, but some won't. And that's what's encouraging about the moment.
Just so you know, according to this memo, he ran a massive global sex trafficking ring just for the fun of it, Corey. No rich people or powerful people were ever involved. There was never any blackmail, no dirt, no leverage. Pam Bondi said it's just Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Bonnie and Clyde of human atrocities, working alone in complete isolation, like two pedophile forest gnomes, never jotting down names. So let me move on from this, because this story is not going to go away. I don't think the cult doesn't want to have their food taken away. But the Martin versus U.S. ruling is actually more interesting and pertains to what we've been talking about. The Supreme Court sent a pretty quiet but kind of clear signal in Martin versus U.S. about federal law enforcement accountability. The question is, can we sue ICE for human rights abuses? Can you walk us through what they did and didn't say about victims being able to seek redress of grievances against agents?
Well, they certainly didn't cut off the possibility of lawsuits against ICE. And I should say, too, just to take a step back, in talking about hope, some of it is about what government officials might do, what we might do politically. We've talked about the importance of a unified resistance, of the No Kings protest. But there also is litigation. In the end, what ICE is doing around the country is violating people's rights. And what are you supposed to do in a system of the rule of law when your rights are violated? You take them to court. And there is something called a really important piece of legislation in all of this called the Federal Tort Claims Act. And it is a way of suing ICE, of suing the federal government itself. The federal government has all sorts of protections. It has various immunities, sovereign immunity, but there is a way still to sue ICE through this piece of legislation. And what the court is doing is they're going back and forth with the 11th Circuit Court, a lower court, circuit court, about the question of whether or not these suits can proceed or not. And the long story short is that ICE officials, ICE officers, have some discretion in the carrying out of their duties. And if they're doing their job, essentially, they shouldn't be sued. And so they're trying to work out where is that line between doing their job and acting illegally. But thankfully, so far, it looks like they are preserving the ability for these suits to go forward. There is another way to sue, I should say, too, that's not at issue in this particular suit, but on the general question, it's important to bring out, which is there's a case called Bivens, which is about using the Constitution to sue when your constitutional rights are violated. Now there, you can't sue ICE itself, but you can hold the individuals to account. And to me, that's as important as suing ICE, because if you're a member of ICE, you're an officer, say, and you act illegally, you might have the impression from this administration that, like the president, you have all sorts of immunities. But really, you are an individual, subject to the laws the same as anyone else. You can be sued under this Bivens idea, Bivens doctrine, the same as anyone else. And actually, you're more accountable, because as working for the government, you can actually violate people's constitutional rights. And then here's a third thing that we haven't talked about. There's the tort claims way of doing it, the Bivens way, suing for constitutional rights against individuals. There also is the possibility that local and state prosecutors might bring criminal charges against members of ICE. And that's one thing that I'm excited to talk to, in part, to the Attorney General of New Mexico, who's going to be our guest next time, someone who's already had success in fighting birthright citizenship. And next week we'll get into it. But it is something that I've started to bring up, that I want to bring up more, especially as we have elected officials on the show. If you commit a crime, you're not immune. And I'd like to see local prosecutors investigating what looked to me like there are crimes being committed by ICE officers.
I'd also like to point out that ICE's budget now rivals the world's militaries. These new concentration camps are being built all over the US. They are deeply unpopular, and it's all a tremendous racist scam because if they wanted border crossings to stop, they would go after the white people who do all the hiring and put up the help wanted sign. The Republican Party will never do anything to take away that low wage labor force. This is all a racist scam. I have to say it every time, Corey. But let
Can
me
I
ask,
say one more thing about
yeah,
that,
please,
John, which is
please,
because we did
please.
talk about it last week, and I just want to emphasize it. Part of why we're focusing on ICE and ways of suing and stopping them is because, as powerful as they are now, they're about to get way more powerful. There is a massive increase. Some estimates I've seen put it as the most funding for any agency, I guess, aside from the Defense Department in American history. It's just historically large, the allocation of funds that are in this bill that's now gotten through both houses of Congress and is, of course, going to be signed by the president. So this is, look, you want to know where the threat of a police state is? It's the destruction of courts and Congress. It also is in the buildup of this federal police force that looks to
Yeah.
be under the control of a loyalist and Secretary Noem.
Oh, I think whatever Democrats promise a Truth and Reconciliation Committee are going to do so well in the fundraising. So we have some listener mail, Corey. Can I ask you a few
Let's do it.
questions on behalf of the
And we need to devote a future episode to this idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because that is what we need. That's the
yeah.
first step of any recovery from this disaster.
Oh yeah, like the one we should have had after the Civil War, after the Iraq War, after Watergate. I could go on, but we have an email from listener Nivea Mercado who asks, is there a possibility that states might have to activate their respective National Guard to defend us from an all-out assault from the federal government? I know that the president has some authority over the National Guard, but if the state is being attacked by the state, little s, attacked by big S, are we all just screwed? Is there a priority for National Guard troops to defend their respective states? It's a good question.
It is a good question, and thank you for this question. Thank you, everyone who's been sending them. If you want to participate in this and send a question about this episode or a previous one, write to me at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. We'll answer as many as we can. This one really spoke to me because I see the sensibility of it, which is, look, National Guard is supposed to be defense of the state. And if the federal government is attacking us, then can't they protect individual rights, for instance, against ICE? And the short answer is maybe, but probably not, because there is an ability of the president under legislation that probably should be amended, called the Insurrection Act, to take what is normally a governor's prerogative, control over the state National Guard, and to nationalize them. And that's what you see playing out in California, for instance. So as much as Newsom wants to control the Guard, the administration has pushed back, and we've had a number of cases in which basically both parts of both of them have won. But my worry is that ultimately that statute is going to be interpreted in a way that, by the way, doesn't have that has a kind of admirable past. Eisenhower used the Insurrection Act to
That's right.
integrate schools. But now they're being used to really attack protesters, to shut down rights. And that's what you saw in California. So I think any attempt to use the Guard in that way would be met with an emergency declaration under the Insurrection Act. And my fear is that the Supreme Court would side with the president. Now, final thought. That's why in talking about ICE, I thought this was a great question for today. In talking about ICE, ways of suing, there are other ways of fighting back. Just to say that one is cut off doesn't mean that there aren't other ones that might be successful. But thank you
Absolutely.
so much for this question.
Anastasia asks, I love your pod, always listen. Thank you very much. I can't find how or why no one has reported Bondi or any of these attorneys to their respective bar. It's obvious they're breaking the law. Doesn't that matter? Corey, I get asked this a lot on SiriusXM as well. Bill Clinton was disbarred
Yeah.
by the state of Arkansas because of the way he got around the perjury trap. I mean, I get it that they're going to go after Democrats harder, but a lot of us are waiting for, Elise Stefanik's law school to demand their diploma back. I mean, at what point does the Bar Association have some kind of responsibility for what they've unleashed and sanctioned to the world?
Well, you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's one part of it. I think, frankly, as you know, that we need to see prosecutions, including, if we ever get to the point where it's possible, of the president. And although he has immunity for official acts, he certainly doesn't have immunity for unofficial acts. And many of the acts that are being committed now are not official. So there's another possibility, but a third distinct possibility is those lawyers that have engaged in a breach of ethics. And I think Pam Bondi, when you look into the refusal to obey a court order, what could be a deeper breach of ethics? The shutdown of free speech of non-citizens, enacting policies that just run so contrary to the Constitution and the law that these look like issues in which, yes, a bar association should look into. John Yoo and others during the Bush administration faced inquiries. My understanding is John Yoo never had his bar membership
That's right.
revoked. But one of the things that's so upsetting about the moment is it looks like these people are going to get away scot-free with violations of ethics and the law. And that's not how history works. In the long term, you know that I'm hopeful about the possibility of this recovery. When there is a recovery, the truth comes out. And the truth in the Garcia case, for instance, I think might be grounds for disbarment.
Right.
We
Thank
have
you.
many others.
One last question. Andrew asks, if Trump in fact used Truth Social to threaten opponents, which should be illegal, not to mention violate the Emoluments Clause, we could go on, then hasn't he committed an unofficial act that could expose him to liability even within the parameters of the immunity decision, which only protects official acts? It's a really great point, Corey. I'm inclined to say the listener is exactly right, except for the fact that Pam Bondi's DOJ doesn't care if he's breaking the law, so the case will never be brought. But maybe on a state level?
Well, in the near term, I don't expect, for exactly the reason that you say, anything to happen like this. And part of the problem is that we now have a system, to go to the Pam Bondi point, in which the person charged with enforcing federal law against the President of the United States works for the president, the attorney general. And we had a period of time, and we've talked about it before, we should talk about it more, where we had a fix to that. We had an independent counsel act that really took the responsibility of the prosecution of the president outside the Department of Justice into essentially an independent agency, partly under the control of courts and partly under the control of Congress. If we return to that, then we might see this kind of move, an indictment for the unofficial acts of the president, which include, to my mind, the massive corruption that's going on in essentially taking bribes for official action. Now, to my mind, that there's a question: is that official action? Is January 6th official action?
Right?
No, we need to draw official action so narrowly that it doesn't include most crimes. That's an absurd definition of official action. Official action doesn't include the ability to commit crimes. Now, how are we going to narrow that immunity decision? This Supreme Court has defined it in a way that potentially looks pretty broad. One other way to narrow it is to have future legislation that defines what an official act is and what it isn't, and makes it clear that most of these crimes, including the financial crimes of the president, are not official acts. So this is a great question. The immunity decision is a disaster. I believe it's incentivized so much of this criminal activity. But on the other hand, it leaves room for prosecution, even of the president, and maybe not a sitting president, but a former president. And that's one of the things when we talk about this recovery that will be so important.
Corey, I am so grateful for you helping me and so many others have a better understanding of the law. I really, really do. This podcast has been so great for me. It helps me with my show. What is the best way for our listeners to follow you, Professor, and to keep up with all your brilliance all week long?
Well, let me just say we're almost at 300 reviews, which I'm told is a really unusual amount. It shows the dedication of the listeners. I should say they're all 5 stars, which is nice to see too. And help us, get to that 300 mark this week. We have, if you want to watch a video version of this, we have a YouTube channel now, The Oath in the Office, which is taking off. And most important, share it with friends. Let them know about the show. Write a review, not just leave a star. And spread the word, because we're growing rapidly. We were well within the top 10 in terms of overall shows in the government category for the last few weeks, and our episode last week hit around 12 in the government category. So this is
Nice.
catching on and growing, and it's because of you and because you're spreading the word. So John, I would just be some professor sounding off about things, but you help me break it down to make it clear. You make it clear. You bring this needed humor, and
Thank
so
you.
grateful too to these listeners for these questions. Keep them coming at Corey.Brettschneider@gmail. And you can also find me on Blue Sky, Democracy Prof.
Thank you so much, Corey. And yes, my book is called Separation of Church and Hate. It's on sale now, releasing next month. I have a Substack where I am publishing a lot of stuff there all the time. And otherwise, you can just find me on social media enjoying all the right wing folks who didn't realize Superman was an immigrant until now. This is The Oath in the Office. I want to thank Wendy and everybody who helps us put the show together. Folks, please do listen to Corey and subscribe and write reviews, please, and tell your friends. We sure do appreciate it. You can write to us anytime as well with your questions, and we will see you next time on The Oath in the Office.
And just a quick promo, John, it
Yeah,
was a great close, but I
please
got to just say one quick thing, which
slip
is
it in.
don't miss next week. The Attorney General of New Mexico is joining us. It'll be an in-depth half-hour conversation. This is the guy who stopped birthright citizenship in its tracks in New Mexico. He's still pursuing it. He's going to talk about other ways of resisting Trump. This is somebody on the front lines, an elected official to watch, who's going to be at the center of national politics. So we'll see you next week for a special episode.
Can't wait. See you then.